The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. People hurried about their business, some with worried faces, others with determination in their steps. The building buzzed with the quiet energy of important matters being decided. Among the crowd walked a woman who seemed to fade into the background. She was in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes weren't fancy, just a plain beige sweater and brown skirt that had seen better days. She carried an old leather bag that was cracked at the edges from years of use. This was Rosa Mendez, and unlike the lawyers rushing past in their expensive suits, she looked like she might be there to pay a parking ticket. No one gave her a second glance as she checked a crumpled piece of paper, then made her way to courtroom 7. "Excuse me," she asked a clerk at the information desk, her voice soft with a slight accent. "Is this where the small claims cases are heard today?" The clerk barely looked up from his computer. "Yes, sign in on that sheet over there. Judge Patterson starts at 9 sharp. Rosa nodded her thanks and went to add her name to the list. Her handwriting was neat but not fancy. Unlike the flowing signatures of the attorneys who had signed before her, the wooden benches in the back of the courtroom were already filling up with people waiting for their cases to be called. Rosa chose a spot in the corner away from everyone else. From her worn bag, she pulled out a simple notebook with dog-eared pages and a ballpoint pen with a chewed cap. For the next 30 minutes, she sat quietly watching everything around her. Her eyes missed nothing, not the way the court officer arranged his paperwork or how the attorneys greeted each other like old friends, or the nervous fidgeting of those who, like her, seemed out of place in this world of legal proceedings. When the side door opened and a man in black robes swept in, everyone stood. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Patterson," announced the court officer. Judge Patterson was a man who clearly enjoyed his position of power. In his late 50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, he moved with the confidence of someone used to having the final say. He didn't smile as he took his seat and gestured for everyone else to sit down. "Let's get through today's calendar efficiently, folks," he said, his voice filling the room without effort. "I have a golf game at 3. A few of the regular attorneys chuckled. They knew the judge's ways and had learned to play along. The nervous people on the benches didn't laugh. They clutched their papers tighter. Rosa observed all of this, occasionally, making small notes in her book. When she wasn't writing, her hands rested calmly in her lap. Unlike the other non-lawyers in the room, she didn't seem afraid, just watchful. The first few cases moved quickly. A landlord-tenant dispute was settled with a payment plan. A car accident claim was dismissed when the plaintiff couldn't provide proper evidence. A contract disagreement between small business owners was rescheduled when one party asked for more time to gather documents. Through it all, Judge Patterson showed varying degrees of patience. He was cordial to the attorneys, tolerant of their clients, and visibly annoyed by anyone trying to represent themselves. "Next case," called the clerk after the small business owners had left. "Mendez versus Westview Property Management." Rosa gathered her things and made her way to the plaintiff's table. On the other side of the room, a young man in an expensive suit strode confidently to the defense table. He had slick hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Todd Reynolds for Westview Properties, Your Honor," he said, straightening his tie. The judge nodded in recognition. "Mr. Reynolds, always a pleasure." Then he turned to Rosa, his expression changing to one of barely concealed impatience. "And you are?" "Rosa Mendez, Your Honor," she replied, setting her notebook on the table. "And you're representing yourself today, Ms. Mendez?" The question carried a hint of disapproval. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge sighed, making it clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was going to slow things down. "Very well. What seems to be the problem?" Rosa began to explain her case in simple terms. "I cleaned houses for Westview Properties for 3 years. They owe me $12,700 for work I did on their vacation rentals before they fired me without notice." "Your Honor," interrupted Reynolds, "this claim has no merit. Ms. Mendez was an independent contractor who failed to meet our company's standards. We had every right to terminate our arrangement." Judge Patterson nodded, already seeming to side with the attorney. Ms. Mendez, do you have a contract stating you were owed this money? Rosa reached into her bag and pulled out some papers. As she did, several items fell to the floor. A granola bar, reading glasses with a string attached, and a few receipts. A muffled laugh came from somewhere in the gallery. I'm sorry, she said, bending down to pick up her things. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The judge drummed his fingers on the bench. We don't have all day, Ms. Mendez. I apologize, Your Honor, she said, finally finding the paper she was looking for. She approached the bench to hand it over, but the judge pointed to the clerk instead. Give it to Mr. Garcia. He'll pass it to me. The clerk took the paper and handed it to the judge, who glanced at it for barely 2 seconds before looking back at Rosa with raised eyebrows. This is a handwritten list of dates and houses, Ms. Mendez. This is not a contract. It's my work log, Your Honor. Mr. Reynolds's boss, Mrs. Taylor, would sign at the bottom after I finished each house. Rosa pointed to the signatures at the bottom of each entry. The judge squinted at the paper. I see some scribbles here, but this hardly constitutes proper documentation of employment. I was paid in cash most times, Your Honor, but for the last month they kept saying the check was coming. Then they told me they didn't need me anymore. Reynolds jumped in. Your Honor, Westview has dozens of cleaning contractors. Ms. Mendez was let go because of quality issues. We have photos showing substandard work. He handed a folder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Patterson flipped through it with much more interest than he had shown Rosa's papers. I see, he said, nodding. Ms. Mendez, it appears the quality of your work was not up to the standard expected by your client. Rosa tried to speak. Your Honor, those pictures. The judge held up his hand, cutting her off. Ms. Mendez, I understand you may be unfamiliar with court procedures, but please don't interrupt while I'm reviewing evidence. From her place at the plaintiff's table, Rosa watched the judge with careful eyes. She glanced down at her notebook, then back up. Something subtle shifted in her posture. Nothing dramatic, but she seemed to stand a bit straighter. May I respond to the photos, Your Honor? She asked when the judge finally looked up. Briefly, he said with a wave of his hand. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light. Those photos are not from houses I cleaned. The furniture is different. From any of the vacation rentals I worked in. Reynolds scoffed. Your Honor, Ms. Mendez can hardly be expected to remember every detail of every house she cleaned. These are indeed from Westview properties. The judge nodded in agreement. Mr. Reynolds makes a valid point. Rosa opened her notebook. I have photos too, Your Honor, of every house before and after I cleaned it. It was required by Mrs. Taylor. For the first time, Reynolds looked slightly uncomfortable. You have photos? The judge asked, sounding surprised that someone like Rosa would think to document her work. Yes, Your Honor, and text messages from Mrs. Taylor praising my work. She pulled out a worn smartphone from her bag. May I show you? The judge sighed again, checking his watch. Mr. Garcia, please. The clerk walked over to take Rosa's phone. As he did, he noticed the careful organization of her notebook, pages neatly labeled by date, with detailed notes in handwriting that was unexpectedly precise and clear. While the judge looked through her phone with obvious reluctance, Rosa stood quietly. Unlike earlier, when she had seemed flustered by dropping her things, now she waited, with calm patience. Her eyes occasionally met those of Reynolds, who began shuffling his papers with increasing agitation. A few of the attorneys waiting for their cases had stopped their whispered conversations to watch. Something about this simple cleaning woman's calm confidence in the face of the judge's dismissive attitude had caught their attention. Judge Patterson handed the phone back to his clerk with a slight frown. He looked at Rosa with new, if still, skeptical eyes. Ms. Mendez, while your photos do show clean houses, this still doesn't prove you weren't paid for your services. I understand, Your Honor, Rosa replied. Her accent seemed less noticeable now. If I may, I also have bank records showing the regular cash deposits from my work with Westview, which suddenly stopped 3 months ago despite my continued work. She pulled out another paper from her bag, this time without dropping anything. The courtroom had grown quieter. Even the people waiting for their cases were paying attention now, sensing that something unexpected was happening. As the judge examined her bank statements, Rosa stood with her hands folded in front of her. For someone who had appeared so ordinary and forgettable when she walked in, she now seemed to have a presence that filled her corner of the courtroom. Reynolds leaned over to whisper something to a colleague who had joined him. Their hushed conversation carried an edge of concern that hadn't been there before. The judge looked up from the papers, his expression hard to read. He glanced at Reynolds, then back at Rosa. For the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, he truly looked at her. Not as an inconvenience in his busy day, but as someone who might actually have a legitimate case. "Well, Ms. Mendez," he said slowly, "it appears we may need to look at this matter more carefully than I initially thought." Judge Patterson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The courtroom remained unusually quiet as everyone watched the interaction unfold between the judge, the cleaning woman, and the slick attorney from Westview Property Management. "Let's continue," the judge said, his tone slightly less dismissive than before. "Mr. Reynolds, how do you respond to Ms. Mendez's evidence?" Reynolds straightened his tie and regained his confident smile. "Your Honor, these bank statements merely show that Ms. Mendez received payments at some point. They don't prove she wasn't paid for the specific work in question. Westview has hundreds of transactions with contractors every month." The judge nodded, seeming to find comfort in the attorney's familiar legal language. "A fair point, Mr. Reynolds." Rosa waited patiently for her turn to speak. When the judge's eyes turned to her, she opened her notebook to a specific page. "Your Honor, if I may," she began. "Yes, Ms. Mendez, but please be brief. We have a full docket today." Judge Patterson glanced at his watch again, making sure everyone noticed his growing impatience. "My work for Westview was always paid on Fridays." "Every Friday for 3 years?" Rosa explained, running her finger down a column of dates in her notebook. "The payment stopped on April 12th, but I continued working until May 17th. Their text messages show they kept promising payment was coming." She pulled out printed copies of text messages and handed them to the clerk. Judge Patterson's frown deepened as he reviewed them. "Mrs. Taylor's messages clearly show she was happy with my work, and that payment was coming next week for 5 weeks straight," Rosa added. Reynolds jumped in. "Your Honor, these could be taken out of context. We don't even know if these messages are authentic." The judge looked at the texts with narrowed eyes. "They appear to be from a Carol T. Is that Carol Taylor, the property manager at Westview?" "Yes, Your Honor," both Rosa and Reynolds answered simultaneously. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the bench. "While this evidence is interesting, Ms. Mendez, I must remind you that small claims court has specific rules of procedure that must be followed." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. A few attorneys waiting for their cases exchanged glances. One whispered something to another, who nodded in agreement. "I understand, Your Honor," Rosa replied politely. "Do you? Because it seems to me that you've come in here with a notebook and some text messages, expecting to win against a legitimate business." The judge's voice grew louder. "This court runs on legal principles, not sob stories from house cleaners." A few gasps came from the gallery. Even Reynolds looked uncomfortable at the judge's harsh tone. "Your Honor," Rosa began again, her voice still calm, "I believe the evidence shows—" "Ms. Mendez," Judge Patterson interrupted. "Do you have any formal legal training? Have you ever studied contract law?" Rosa hesitated for just a moment. "No formal training, Your Honor." "That's what I thought." The judge smiled, satisfied. "Yet you're attempting to argue a contract dispute against counsel who has spent years studying these matters." Reynolds seemed to gain confidence from the judge's words. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss this case due to lack of sufficient evidence. Ms. Mendez has not provided proper documentation of a formal employment relationship, nor has she proven that the work in question wasn't paid for." Judge Patterson nodded, clearly leaning toward granting the motion. "Ms. Mendez, do you have anything substantive to add before I rule on Mr. Reynolds' motion?" Rosa stood a little straighter. Those watching closely might have noticed a subtle Change in her demeanor, a slight lift of her chin, a steadiness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to address the legal basis of Mr. Reynolds' motion. The judge's eyebrows shot up. The legal basis? He chuckled, looking around the courtroom as if sharing a private joke with the other legal professionals. By all means, enlighten us. A few snickers could be heard from the gallery. Reynolds didn't join in the laughter, though. Something about Rosa's calm confidence made him uneasy. Mr. Reynolds argues I haven't established an employment relationship, Rosa began, her accent seeming to fade slightly. However, under state labor law, a worker receiving regular payment for services over an extended period establishes a de facto employment relationship, regardless of whether a formal contract exists. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Patterson's smile faded. Furthermore, Rosa continued, the Supreme Court case of Jenkins versus Williams established that regular payment creates an implied contract that cannot be unilaterally terminated without proper notice if the worker can demonstrate continued reliance on the income. Reynolds shuffled through his papers frantically. Your Honor, I'm not familiar with this Jenkins case. Jenkins versus Williams 2017, Rosa supplied helpfully. It was a landmark case for independent contractors. The judge's expression had transformed from amusement to confusion. Ms. Mendez, how exactly do you know about this case law? I read, Your Honor, she replied simply. The public library has excellent legal resources. A few people in the gallery exchanged impressed glances. The court clerk was watching Rosa with newfound interest. Judge Patterson cleared his throat. While I appreciate your homework, Ms. Mendez, citing random cases doesn't change the fact that you need proper evidence. I understand, Your Honor. Rosa nodded. Which is why I'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibit C. She pulled out another document from her bag. This is an email from Mrs. Taylor outlining the payment schedule and expectations for all Westview cleaning staff. You'll notice my name is listed on page 3, along with the houses I was responsible for and the agreed payment amounts. The clerk handed this new evidence to the judge. Reynolds stood up. Your Honor, this is the first time we're seeing this document. We question its authenticity and request time to verify it. Judge Patterson studied the document with growing concern. Ms. Mendez, why didn't you present this evidence at the beginning of the hearing? I tried to explain my full case, Your Honor, but I was instructed to be brief, she answered without a hint of accusation in her voice. Yet everyone in the courtroom felt the subtle reminder of how the judge had repeatedly cut her off. The judge's cheeks reddened slightly. Yes, well, court efficiency is important. He studied the document more carefully. This does appear to be on Westview letterhead. Reynolds approached the bench. Your Honor, even if this document is authentic, it doesn't prove the specific work Ms. Mendez is claiming payment for was actually completed. That's what the photos on my phone demonstrate, Your Honor, Rosa replied, each dated and time-stamped, showing before and after pictures of the properties in question, with Mrs. Taylor's confirmatory text responses. Judge Patterson looked increasingly uncomfortable. What had seemed like an open and shut case was becoming complicated. He had already shown clear bias toward the defense, and now the seemingly simple cleaning woman was presenting surprisingly solid evidence and legal arguments. Ms. Mendez, the judge said, his tone noticeably different now. For someone with no legal training, you seem unusually prepared for this hearing. Thank you, Your Honor, Rosa replied. This money means a lot to me. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I did my best to learn what I needed to know. Several of the waiting attorneys were now openly watching the proceedings with interest. One of them, an older woman with silver hair, was studying Rosa with particular intensity. Judge Patterson turned to Reynolds. Counsel, how do you respond to this new evidence? Reynolds loosened his collar slightly. We would need time to authenticate these documents, Your Honor, and to prepare a proper response to Ms. Mendez's unexpected arguments. I bet you would, someone muttered from the gallery, just loud enough to be heard. The judge shot a stern look toward the source of the comment before turning back to the case at hand. Ms. Mendez, do you have any other evidence or arguments to present? Rosa nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to address the claim that my work was substandard, which Mr. Reynolds presented as the reason for my termination. Proceed, the judge said, now listening with genuine attention. The photos Mr. Reynolds submitted don't match any of the properties I serviced for Westview. I can prove this because the furnishings and layouts are different. She pulled out her own set of photos. These are the actual vacation rentals I cleaned. You can verify the addresses with the property listings on Westview's website. As the clerk handed these photos to the judge, Rosa continued. Additionally, I have written performance reviews from Mrs. Taylor for each month I worked there, all rating my work as excellent or outstanding. The last review was dated just 1 week before I was let go. Reynolds was now frantically whispering with his colleague. The judge's expression grew increasingly troubled as he compared the two sets of photos. Your Honor, Reynolds finally said, standing again, we request a brief recess to consult with our client. Judge Patterson studied Reynolds for a moment, then looked back at Rosa, who stood calmly waiting for his decision. The contrast between the flustered attorney and the composed cleaning woman wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Before I rule on that request, the judge said slowly, I have a question for Ms. Mendez. He leaned forward, studying her with new eyes. Where exactly did you learn to prepare a case like this? Rosa met his gaze steadily. When you can't afford an attorney, Your Honor, you learn to advocate for yourself. Something about the way she said it, the quiet dignity in her voice, made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. The judge himself seemed to be reassessing the woman standing before him. I see, he said finally. Mr. Reynolds, you may have your recess, 20 minutes. He banged his gavel. This court is in recess. As people began to move and talk, Rosa quietly gathered her materials and returned to her seat on the bench. A few people nodded to her respectfully as she passed. The silver-haired attorney watching from the gallery pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, her eyes occasionally darting to Rosa with unmistakable interest. The 20-minute recess stretched to 30 as Reynolds and his colleague huddled in the hallway, speaking in urgent whispers while occasionally glancing back at the courtroom doors. Inside, Rosa sat quietly on her bench, reviewing her notes and seemingly unbothered by the delay. Several people approached her during the break. A young law student who asked where she'd learned about the Jenkins case, an elderly man who wanted to know if she could help with his own dispute against a former employer, and a court reporter who slipped her a business card with a wink. I might want to talk to you after this is all over, the reporter said. You've made today a lot more interesting than most small claims hearings. Rosa smiled politely but didn't engage in much conversation. Her focus remained on the papers in front of her, carefully organizing them for when the judge returned. The silver-haired attorney who had been watching from the gallery made her way over and sat down beside Rosa. That was quite impressive, she said quietly. Rosa looked up. Thank you, but I'm just trying to get what I'm owed. Of course. The attorney nodded. I'm Claire Donovan, by the way. I've been practicing law in this county for 30 years. Nice to meet you, Rosa replied simply, not offering much more. Claire studied her with curious eyes. You know, we could use someone with your attention to detail at our legal aid clinic. It's volunteer work, but before she could finish, the bailiff called out. All rise. Court is back in session. Judge Patterson returned to the bench, his face noticeably more serious than before. Reynolds and his colleague hurried back to their table, looking flustered. As everyone took their seats, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Mr. Reynolds, the judge said, are you ready to proceed? Reynolds cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. After consulting with our client, Westview Property Management would like to... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Offer to settle this matter. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. I see. And the terms of this settlement? Full payment of the $2,700 claimed by Ms. Mendez, plus an additional $300 for inconvenience. Judge Patterson turned to Rosa. Ms. Mendez, do you accept this offer? Rosa closed her notebook slowly. No, Your Honor, I do not. The murmurs grew louder. Reynolds looked shocked. Even the judge seemed surprised. Ms. Mendez, the defendant is offering more than your original claim. May I ask why you're declining? The judge's tone was different now. not condescending but genuinely curious. Rosa stood up straight, her voice clear and steady. Your Honor, my original claim was for $2,700 in unpaid wages. But after reviewing state labor law during my preparation, for this case I realized that unpaid wages entitle workers to triple damages when the employer has willfully withheld payment. The judge's eyes widened slightly. You're referring to Section 148B of the Labor Code? Yes, Your Honor, which would amount to $8,100 plus reasonable costs for bringing this action. Reynolds jumped up. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Ms. Mendez can't just suddenly triple her claim in the middle of proceedings. Actually, Mr. Reynolds, the judge replied, his tone measured, the plaintiff isn't changing her claim. She's correctly citing the statutory damages allowed under state law. He turned back to Rosa. Though I must say, Ms. Mendez, most non-attorneys aren't familiar with the triple damages provision. Rosa met his gaze steadily. The public law library has been very helpful, Your Honor, and the librarian there is extremely knowledgeable. Few chuckles spread through the courtroom. Judge Patterson almost smiled before catching himself. Your Honor, Reynolds interjected, even if Ms. Mendez is citing the correct statute, she still needs to prove that Westview willfully withheld payment. Our position is that there was a legitimate dispute over the quality of services. A dispute you attempted to support with photos that don't match the properties Ms. Mendez actually cleaned, the judge replied, surprising everyone with how quickly he had shifted to taking Rosa's evidence seriously. Reynolds' face reddened. We may have mistakenly included the wrong photos in our evidence packet. Wrong photos? Judge Patterson repeated, his voice hardening. Mr. Reynolds, are you admitting to submitting false evidence to this court? The courtroom went completely silent. Reynolds loosened his tie nervously. Not intentionally, Your Honor. There was confusion in our filing system. I see. The judge's expression made it clear he didn't believe this explanation. He turned to Rosa again. Ms. Mendez, I'm interested in your thoughts on proving the willful element required for triple damages. Rosa nodded and opened her notebook again. Your Honor, I believe the text messages already submitted show clear intent to delay payment, with no mention of any quality concerns until after I inquired about my wages for the 5th time. She flipped to another page. Additionally, I have records showing that Westview terminated 3 other cleaning contractors in the same month, all of whom were owed similar amounts. The judge's eyebrows shot up. You have evidence of a pattern? Yes, Your Honor. Rosa pulled out several affidavits. These are sworn statements from Ana Diaz, Luisa Perez, and Chen Wei, all former Westview contractors who experienced the same treatment. They're all here in the courtroom today if you wish to speak with them. 3 women sitting in the back row raised their hands. Reynolds looked like he might faint. Judge Patterson took the affidavits from the clerk and reviewed them carefully. The courtroom remained hushed as he read, the only sound the occasional flip of paper. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Reynolds, did you know about these other contractors? Reynolds whispered urgently with his colleague before responding. Your Honor, we were not aware that Ms. Mendez had been in contact with these other individuals. Westview treats each contractor relationship as separate and— That wasn't my question, the judge interrupted. Were you aware of these similar claims against your client? After a long pause, Reynolds answered, Yes, Your Honor. Judge Patterson nodded slowly, then turned back to Rosa. Ms. Mendez, your preparation for this case has been remarkably thorough. I'm curious, how did you connect with these other contractors? Rosa's expression remained calm and professional. We all use the same laundromat, Your Honor. When I mentioned my situation, I discovered I wasn't alone. There was something so simple and honest about her answer that several people in the gallery nodded in understanding. This wasn't a complex legal strategy, just ordinary people comparing notes while doing their laundry. The judge seemed to appreciate this too. He shuffled the papers on his bench thoughtfully before speaking again. Ms. Mendez, one more question, if you don't mind. The legal arguments you've presented today show uncommon knowledge for someone without formal training. May I ask what you do for a living, besides cleaning houses? Rosa hesitated for just a moment. I work several jobs, Your Honor. Cleaning, babysitting, helping at my cousin's restaurant on weekends, whatever it takes to support my family. I see, the judge said, studying her with new respect. And somewhere in between all that, you found time to become remarkably well-versed in labor law. When something matters enough, you make the time, she replied simply. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even those waiting for their own cases were fully engrossed in the exchange between the judge and the cleaning woman who had surprised everyone. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. Indeed. He straightened up and addressed the entire courtroom. Having reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, I'm prepared to rule on this matter. Unless Mr. Reynolds has something substantial to add? Reynolds looked defeated. No, Your Honor. But we would like to renew our settlement offer, perhaps in the amount of $5,000, to resolve this matter expeditiously. The judge looked at Rosa. Ms. Mendez, are you interested in the increased settlement offer? Rosa thought. For a moment. Your Honor, I would accept $8,100 as originally calculated under the statute, plus $500 for court costs and time missed from work. Reynolds whispered frantically with his colleague again before responding. Your Honor, my client authorizes me to accept those terms. Judge Patterson nodded. Very well. The court recognizes and approves the settlement agreement between Rosa, Mendez, and Westview Property Management in the amount of $8,600. He struck his gavel. Ms. Mendez, the court appreciates your thorough preparation and presentation in this matter. Thank you, Your Honor, Rosa replied with a respectful nod. As she gathered her papers, Reynolds approached her, looking both frustrated and impressed. Ms. Mendez, that was unexpected. Where did you learn to argue like that? Rosa looked at him with a small smile. Life teaches you to stand up for yourself, Mr. Reynolds, sometimes in ways you never planned. As Rosa turned to leave, she found several people waiting to speak with her. The 3 other cleaning contractors rushed up to hug her. The court clerk gave her a thumbs up. Claire Donovan, the silver-haired attorney, handed Rosa her business card. My offer about the legal aid clinic stands, Claire said. We need people who understand both the law and real life. Rosa thanked her and carefully tucked the card into her notebook. From his bench, Judge Patterson watched this scene with growing curiosity. He signaled to his clerk, who approached quickly. Mr. Garcia, find out more about Ms. Mendez, would you? There's something unusual about her understanding of the law for someone with no formal training. The clerk nodded. I was thinking the same thing, Your Honor. I'll see what I can find out. As Rosa walked toward the exit, people moved aside respectfully, some even congratulating her. The simple cleaning woman who had been all but invisible when she entered the courtroom now commanded attention with each step. Judge Patterson called his next case, but his eyes kept drifting back to Rosa as she reached the doors. There was something about her, the precision of her arguments, the confidence that had emerged as the hearing progressed, that didn't quite match the humble cleaning woman she claimed to be. Before leaving, Rosa turned back once to look at the courtroom. For just a moment, her eyes met the judge's, and he could have sworn he saw something there, a flash of knowledge, of assessment, that made him suddenly uncomfortable. As the doors closed behind her, Judge Patterson couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Rosa Mendez than anyone in his courtroom had realized. The afternoon session of court had begun, but the morning's events still buzzed through the courthouse. In the hallway, people who hadn't even been in the courtroom were talking about the cleaning woman who had outmaneuvered a professional attorney. Court staff passed the story between themselves during lunch breaks, each version growing slightly more dramatic than the last. Judge Patterson tried to focus on the cases before him, but his mind kept drifting back to Rosa Mendez. Something about her bothered him, not just her surprising legal knowledge, but the way she had carried herself as the hearing progressed. The transformation had been subtle, but unmistakable. Your Honor? The attorney currently presenting a case looked at him expectantly. I apologize, the judge said, straightening in his chair. Please continue. As the attorney resumed his argument, the courtroom door opened quietly. Garcia, the clerk who had been tasked with finding out more about Rosa Mendez, slipped back into the room. His eyes were wide and he clutched a folder in his hands. He moved quickly to the judge's bench and placed a note beside Patterson's water glass. The judge glanced down at the hastily scribbled message. Need to speak with you urgently about Mendez case. Found something important. Judge Patterson frowned, but continued listening to the case before him. When the attorney finally finished his presentation, the judge called for a 15-minute recess and motioned for Garcia to follow him to his chambers. Once the heavy wooden door closed behind them, Patterson turned to his clerk. What did you find, Mr. Garcia? Garcia opened the folder, his hands almost trembling with excitement. You're not going to believe this, Judge. I started with a basic background check on Rosa Mendez, and I found something strange right away. There are 2 Rosa Mendezes in our county records. That's hardly unusual, Mr. Garcia. It's a common name. Yes, but one is a 47-year-old house cleaner who lives in the East Side apartment complex. The other, Garcia paused for dramatic effect, is listed as Dr. Rosa Mendez Colon, professor of law at Capital University. Judge Patterson stared at him. You think our Rosa Mendez is actually a law professor? I wasn't sure at first, Garcia continued, so I pulled up the university directory. Dr. Mendez Colon is on sabbatical this semester, and look at this. He pulled out a printout from the university website showing faculty profiles. The judge took the page and found himself looking at a professional headshot of a woman in a tailored suit and stylish glasses. Her hair was elegantly styled, and she wore subtle makeup that highlighted her confident smile. Despite these differences, the face was unmistakably that of the simple, cleaning woman who had stood in his courtroom that morning. Good Lord, Patterson whispered, sinking into his chair. There's more, Garcia said, unable to contain his excitement. Dr. Mendez Colon isn't just any law professor. She literally wrote the textbook on labor law that's used by most law schools in the state, and she's a former clerk for Justice Hernandez on the state Supreme Court. Judge Patterson felt the blood drain from his face as he remembered his condescending comments to her. Are you absolutely certain this is the same woman? Garcia nodded eagerly. I called a friend who works at Capital University. He confirmed that Dr. Mendez Colon has been conducting what she calls field research for her upcoming book. He pulled out another printout. It's called Justice for All, Access and Bias in the American Legal System. Patterson groaned, covering his face with his hands. And I treated her like she was... He couldn't even finish the sentence. There's one more thing, Judge. Garcia looked almost apologetic now. The court reporter mentioned that there was a journalist from the Legal Times in the gallery this morning. Apparently, they got a tip about an interesting case in small claims court. E-tip? The judge looked up sharply. You mean she planned this? She wanted to be treated poorly? Garcia shrugged. I can't say for sure, but it looks like she's been doing similar experiments in courtrooms across the state. My friend at the University said she's been gathering data on how self-represented litigants are treated compared to those with attorneys. Judge Patterson sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Everything about the morning's case suddenly made sense. Rosa's perfectly prepared evidence, her strategic revelation of legal knowledge, the way she had given him every opportunity to treat her with the same respect he showed the attorneys, and he had failed spectacularly. Judge? Garcia prompted after the silence stretched uncomfortably long. What do you want to do? Patterson stood up and straightened his robes. What can I do? We have a courtroom waiting. He moved toward the door, then paused. Is she still in the building, do you know? I saw her talking with some of the law student volunteers near the cafeteria about 20 minutes ago, Garcia replied. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Let's get back to court. As they walked back to the courtroom, Patterson's mind raced. The afternoon docket included 3 more self-represented litigants, people who, like Rosa had pretended to be, couldn't afford attorneys and had to navigate the complex legal system on their own. People he had routinely rushed through their cases, often with the same dismissive attitude he had shown Rosa that morning. The realization made him deeply uncomfortable. When they re-entered the courtroom, Patterson immediately noticed something different. In the back row, where Rosa had first sat that morning, now sat an elegantly dressed woman with styled hair and professional glasses, watching the proceedings with keen interest. Though her appearance was transformed, her eyes were unmistakable. Dr. Rosa Mendez Colon had returned to observe the afternoon session. Their eyes met briefly as he took his seat at the bench. She gave him a small, knowing nod. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Patterson cleared his throat. "Before we continue with the next case, I'd like to make a brief statement." The courtroom quieted immediately. "It has come to my attention that I may have been overly brusque in my handling of some cases today. The court's duty is to provide equal justice to all who appear before it, regardless of whether they are represented by counsel or not." Murmurs spread through the gallery. A few attorneys exchanged confused glances. To that end, the judge continued, "I will be taking additional time with our self-represented litigants to ensure they fully understand the proceedings and have ample opportunity to present their cases." He glanced briefly at Rosa. "Justice is not served when we rush to judgment." From her seat in the back, Rosa made a small note in her notebook, her expression neutral but attentive. "Now let's proceed with the next case," the judge said, nodding to Garcia. "Alvarez versus City Transit Authority," Garcia called out. An elderly man with weathered hands and a worn suit jacket slowly made his way to the plaintiff's table. On the other side, two attorneys in crisp suits confidently arranged their documents. "Good afternoon, Mr. Alvarez," Judge Patterson said, his tone markedly different from earlier that day. "Please take your time getting settled. Would you like some water before we begin?" The old man looked up in surprise. "Si. Yes, please, Your Honor." As Garcia brought water to Mr. Alvarez, Judge Patterson caught Rosa's eye again. She gave him an approving nod. The afternoon proceeded with the judge showing remarkable patience with each self-represented litigant. He explained legal terms when necessary, asked clarifying questions to help people express their claims more effectively, and held the attorneys to strict standards of evidence. By the time the last case concluded, the sun was setting outside the courthouse windows. Judge Patterson had run nearly an hour over his usual schedule, but not once had he mentioned his golf game or checked his watch. As people filed out of the courtroom, Rosa remained seated, making final notes in her book. The judge spoke quietly to Garcia, then walked down from the bench and approached her. "Dr. Mendez Colon, I presume," he said, extending his hand. Rosa looked up with a small smile. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out." She shook his hand firmly. "Not as long as you might think, though certainly long enough to make a fool of myself." The judge's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. "Your research methodology is rather effective. The most valuable data comes from authentic experiences, Judge Patterson." She closed her notebook. "People show their true selves when they think no one important is watching." The judge winced at the gentle rebuke. "I deserve that. My behavior this morning was inexcusable." "On the contrary," Rosa replied, standing up. Without her deliberately stooped posture from the morning, she stood nearly eye to eye with him. It was entirely consistent with what self-represented litigants experience every day in courtrooms across the country. The only difference is that most of them don't get to come back in the afternoon and watch the judge suddenly develop patience. Judge Patterson nodded solemnly. "Your point is well taken, Doctor. Though I admit, I'm curious about something. Why did you turn down their initial settlement offer? You could have walked away with your money much sooner." Rosa smiled. "Because the case wasn't just about money. It was about dignity and respect in the legal process. And because those other women, Ana, Luisa, and Chen, they deserve justice too." She tucked her notebook into her now elegant leather briefcase. "Their stories were real, by the way. They really did meet me at the laundromat. And the work you did for Westview? Also real. I believe in immersive research, Judge Patterson. I've cleaned houses, worked retail, and waited tables over the past year, all while gathering data for my book." She adjusted her glasses. "You'd be amazed how differently people treat you when they think you're just the help." The judge looked genuinely regretful. "I'm afraid I demonstrated that quite thoroughly today." "Yes. Rosa agreed simply, without malice. But you also showed something else this afternoon, the capacity to change when confronted with your own biases. That's rarer than you might think. She held out a business card to him. My publisher has arranged a series of judicial training seminars based on my research. I think your perspective would be valuable if you're interested. Judge Patterson took the card, reading the embossed lettering. Dr. Rosa Mendez Colon, Professor of Law, Chair of Access to Justice Initiative. I would be honored, though I'm not sure I deserve the opportunity after how I treated you. Growth comes from acknowledging our mistakes, not pretending they didn't happen. Rosa shouldered her briefcase. Besides, your transformation this afternoon was quite remarkable. The question is whether it will last beyond today. The judge straightened his shoulders. I believe it will, Doctor. You've given me much to think about. Good. She smiled and extended her hand once more. Then perhaps some good will come from our performance today. Performance? He repeated, shaking her hand. Yes, Judge Patterson. Yours as the arrogant judge and mine as the simple cleaning woman. We both played our parts. Her eyes twinkled, with humor, though I think mine required more acting skill. With that, she turned and walked confidently down the aisle toward the courtroom doors, leaving Judge Patterson to ponder just how thoroughly he had misjudged the seemingly simple woman who had stood before his bench that morning. 3 months later, the county courthouse looked much the same as it always had. The same marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights. The same wooden benches lined the hallways. The same hushed conversations echoed against the high ceilings. But inside courtroom 7, things were different. Judge Patterson sat at the bench, listening carefully to a young man in a worn jacket who was representing himself in a dispute with his former landlord. The judge's questions were patient and clear, helping the nervous man explain his situation without legal jargon. So you're saying you have photographs showing the damage existed before you moved in? The judge asked. Yes, sir. I mean, Your Honor, the young man replied, fumbling with his phone. I always take pictures whenever I rent a new place. That's very wise, Judge Patterson said. Mr. Garcia will help you share those images with the court. From his place beside the bench, Garcia, who had recently been promoted to senior clerk, stepped forward with a tablet device that could display the photos on the courtroom's monitor. This was one of several new procedures implemented in the past months to help self-represented litigants present their evidence more effectively. In the gallery, several first-year law students sat taking notes. They were part of a new court observation program initiated by Capital University's law school, specifically by the chair of the Access to Justice Initiative. As the young tenant's case concluded, Judge Patterson delivered his ruling, carefully, explaining the legal reasoning behind his decision so that both parties could understand it. When he finished, he looked out at the gallery. Before we take our mid-morning recess, I'd like to welcome our observers from Capital University. I hope you're finding these proceedings educational. The students nodded enthusiastically. Court is in recess for 15 minutes, the judge announced, striking his gavel. As people began to move about, the courthouse doors opened and a familiar figure entered. Dr. Rosa Mendez Colon walked confidently down the aisle, dressed in a professional Navy suit. The law students immediately gathered around her, eager to share their observations. Judge Patterson watched from his bench, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. After speaking with her students, Rosa looked up and met his eyes. She gave him a respectful nod, which he returned before retreating to his chambers. Inside, he found Garcia arranging the files for the next set of cases. Dr. Mendez Colon is here with her students, the judge remarked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. I saw, Garcia replied with a knowing smile. Hard to believe that's the same person who stood in our courtroom 3 months ago with that old notebook and worn-out bag. Judge Patterson chuckled. Yet somehow she seems exactly the same to me now. I just couldn't see her clearly before. A knock at the door interrupted them. Come in, the judge called. Rosa entered, closing the door behind her. Good morning. Judge Patterson, I hope we're not disrupting your docket too much with our observation program. Not at all, Doctor. Your students are respectful and attentive. I only hope they're learning something useful." "Oh, they are," she assured him. "In fact, they've been comparing notes from observations across different courtrooms in the county." She smiled. "Yours receives consistently high marks for accessibility and patience with self-represented litigants." The judge looked pleased but waved off the compliment. "Small changes, really. Long overdue." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. How is your research coming along?" Rosa took a seat, placing a leather portfolio on her lap. "Very well, actually. That's partly why I'm here." She opened the portfolio and removed a bound manuscript. "My publisher sent the first printed copy of the book yesterday. I thought you might like to see it before it's officially released next month." She handed him the book. The cover read, "Equal Justice Under Law, Addressing Bias and Barriers in America's Courts," by Dr. Rosa. Mendez-Colon. Judge Patterson ran his hand over the cover. "I'm honored." He flipped to the table of contents, noting chapter titles like The Self-Represented Litigant's Experience and Courtroom Dynamics and Implicit Bias. "Chapter 4 might interest you particularly," Rosa suggested with a hint of mischief in her eyes. The judge turned to the chapter titled The Rosa Experiment, Experiencing Justice from Both Sides of the Bench. His eyes widened as he spotted his own name in the opening paragraph. "You've used my real name?" he asked, surprised. "With your permission, of course," Rosa replied. "I can still change it to a pseudonym before publication if you prefer." Judge Patterson skimmed the chapter, which detailed Rosa's experience in his courtroom that memorable day. To his relief, while the account was honest about his initial dismissive treatment, it also highlighted his afternoon transformation and subsequent reforms. "You've been very fair in your portrayal," he said. "Finally." "I've tried to be accurate," she corrected gently. "This book isn't about vilifying judges, it's about highlighting systemic issues and potential solutions." She tapped the later chapters. "Your court's new procedures are featured as a case study in positive change." The judge closed the book, feeling a complex mix of emotions, lingering embarrassment at his past behavior, pride in the changes he'd implemented, and gratitude for Rosa's generous framing of his story. "I would be honored to be included under my real name," he said at last. "Accountability matters in our profession. I just hope other judges reading this will see themselves in these pages as I did." "Some already have," Rosa replied. "The advance copies sent to judicial associations have generated quite a response. I've received invitations to speak at judicial conferences in 12 states so far." Her eyes twinkled, "and several inquiries about whether I might be conducting similar experiments in their courtrooms." They both laughed at that. "Speaking of your experiment," the judge said, "whatever happened to those other cleaning women? Anna, Louisa, and Chen? Were they really just people you met at the laundromat?" Rosa's expression softened. "They were indeed. And their stories were entirely real. Westview had treated them just as they had treated me in my role. After the case, I helped them file their own claims. All three were settled immediately when Westview realized who was helping them." "And did they receive triple damages as well?" the judge asked with a small smile. "Plus court costs," Rosa confirmed with satisfaction. A knock at the door signaled that the recess was ending. "I should let you get back to your docket," Rosa said, standing. "But there's one more thing I wanted to discuss with you." "Of course. The state Supreme Court is forming a commission on court accessibility and bias. Justice Hernandez asked me to recommend a trial court judge to serve alongside me." She looked at him meaningfully. "Someone with both experience and a demonstrated commitment to improvement." Judge Patterson blinked in surprise. "Me? Surely there are other judges with better records on these issues." "Perhaps," Rosa acknowledged. "But few with your perspective. You've experienced both sides of this issue. The comfortable automatic biases we all carry, and the uncomfortable awakening to their impact." She picked up her book from his desk. "This work isn't about perfect people, Judge. It's about people willing to grow and change systems that aren't serving everyone equally. The judge considered her words carefully. When you put it that way, I would be honored to serve on the commission. Excellent. I'll tell Justice Hernandez to expect your call. Rosa handed him a card with the justice's direct line. As they walked back toward the courtroom together, the judge had one more question. Dr. Mendez Colon, there's something I've been wondering about for months. You clearly had enough evidence to win your case from the beginning. Why go through the charade? Why risk having your claim dismissed by a biased judge like me? Rosa paused at the courtroom door. Because reading about inequality in the justice system isn't the same as experiencing it. I needed to feel what millions of Americans feel every day when they enter courtrooms without expensive suits or law degrees. Her expression was earnest now, and because sometimes, Judge Patterson, the only way to truly see a system's failings is to become its victim, even temporarily. The judge nodded thoughtfully. And what about the money? The $8,600 from Westview? Rosa smiled. It funded a year of free legal clinics at the East Side Community Center, the same neighborhood where Anna, Luisa, and Chen still live. She glanced at her students, who were waiting for her in the gallery. Where most people still can't afford attorneys, despite having legitimate legal claims. There's still so much work to be done, the judge acknowledged. Yes, Rosa agreed. But today, in this courtroom, you're doing it. She gestured to the packed benches where people from all walks of life waited for their cases to be heard. Every person who leaves here feeling they were truly heard, regardless of their background or resources, is a step toward the justice system we're supposed to have. Judge Patterson straightened his robes with renewed purpose. We should get back to it then. As they re-entered the courtroom, everyone rose. The judge took his place at the bench while Rosa joined her students in the gallery. Court is back in session, announced the bailiff. Judge Patterson looked out at the faces before him, a mix of attorneys, self-represented litigants, students, and observers. His eyes lingered briefly on Rosa, the professor who had taught him the most important legal lesson of his career by appearing as a simple cleaning woman in his courtroom. Next case, he said clearly. Garcia, please make sure both parties have copies of our simplified procedure guide, and let's ensure everyone understands exactly how this process works. From her seat in the gallery, Rosa made a small note in her book and smiled with satisfaction. Sometimes real change started with one judge, one courtroom, one case at a time. And sometimes it started with a simple woman who wasn't so simple after all.